everybody. Professor Fiore here, and I am beginning my series on Francis Bacon, the English philosopher who lived around the time of Queen Elizabeth. Now, we're going to just introduce his most, let's say, accessible book. I was going to say most famous book, but that word famous is a little tricky. I'm going to say his most accessible book, a book that is very easy to read. It's easier than Shakespeare, actually, and it has had an incredible influence on the history of science and many, many other things. It's an educational book as well. It talks about why we should seek knowledge, how we can separate useful knowledge from unuseful knowledge, and things like that. So the name of the book is called The Advancement of Learning, and I'm going to just show you the cover here. Um, the Advancement of Learning was published in 1605. And let me show you the cover of my edition. The Advancement of Learning and the New Atlantis by Francis Bacon. My edition is not quite that old. You can maybe see by the fact that the spelling is pretty recognizable, right? So you look at the first few lines, it says, there were under the law, excellent king, both daily sacrifices and free will offerings. And you'll see that if any book that had been written in 1605, whether you're looking at Shakespeare or other writers at that time, you'll see funky spelling and things like that. Why did I choose this edition? Because it's beautiful. It's a beautiful edition. The font is beautiful. The color of the pages is beautiful. And that counts for a lot. I really enjoy paper and running my hand over the page and taking and even the indentation of where the block of type has pressed into the page is also quite beautiful. So it's called The Advancement of Learning, and I'll just kind of present to you a little bit about Francis Bacon and why he would publish such a book at this time, what's the purpose of it, by showing you a couple images of Bacon and his contemporaries. So here is Francis Bacon. For those of you who are just listening, I'm showing this painting of a very rosy-cheeked Francis Bacon, probably in his 30s, early 40s. And that's how old he would have been when he wrote The Advancement of Learning in 1605. Or let's say he published it in 1605. Now, part of the power of the book, it does introduce the idea of experimentation and observation in a very rigorous way so that when we get results from observation in nature, say we're using a microscope or watching objects be broken up, or all the things that scientists have become famous for doing. Remember that 1605 is before Galileo, before Newton. And so this idea of taking natural phenomena and looking at them and breaking it up in a certain way and then examining what you have done is not taken for granted. And so this is one of the many reasons why Bacon is called the father of modern science. So he actually recommends this later would be called the experimental method. And so here he is when he published this in 1605. And I'm just going to show you this is Queen Elizabeth. Now, why am I showing Queen Elizabeth? As I said, I love books, but I also love images. I love the what we can learn by looking at images. Here she is with her pearl lace collar and all her monarchical glory, her authoritative look, um, her red hair, all her uniqueness and power. Now, the Elizabethan age, for better or for worse, I mean, we could look at history in all kinds of ways. But for this class, or for this talk, I want to stress the what is happening in terms of English and communication and ideas, because ideas always happen in a context. And the context isn't always a political one. Often when we talk about the history of science or the history of, let's say, labor or the history of navigation, very often, more often than not, the context will be political. It'll be like, this is the year of Waterloo, or this is the year after the decapitation of the king of blah, 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 blah. Um, but I want to talk about a different context, the context of words themselves. The Elizabethan age, for people who love the story of English, and there's actually an old documentary by McNeill called The Story of English. And the Elizabethan age is an age when English itself is flourishing. And so the idea of a philosopher arising in a time when the very vocabulary of English is expanding, Shakespeare is alive. Shakespeare is expanding almost single-handedly the language, turning nouns into verbs, verbs into nouns, adding metaphors, adding jokes, adding powerful phrases that are repeated again and again, even today, right? And to be or not to be, let loose, let slip the dogs of war, all these kinds of things. Um, so the idea is that when a philosopher or any kind of person who's trying to communicate something new is in a time of history when language itself is expanding, this is a special time. And that's part of the power of the book that I want to talk about. I don't only want to talk about the book itself, but the way that Bacon makes his arguments is itself part of the interest of this book. And I hope I can convince you to appreciate some of these ideas. So the Elizabethan age, known for its rich English, the poetry is exploding, obviously theater. She was a sponsor of Shakespeare. Uh, and here I want to show you a different image of Elizabeth, just to bring home this whole idea of this age of learning, this age of culture, of a different kind of culture. So I'm not a big fan of all these kind of categories of history. Is it the Romantic age? But there is a value in noting that this is the heyday of the English Renaissance. You're getting towards the end of the English Renaissance and around the time of what they call the early modern period. Now, why is the Renaissance as a term important? Because the Renaissance is known as the time when learning, culture, art, music is expanding because it's being fed by uh, recent kind of interest and also discoveries in the ancient world, in Greek and Roman sculpture, in Roman poetry, in Greek philosophy. Not to mention that for England in particular, because Queen Elizabeth's time is a time of a huge expansion of shipbuilding, they're navigating all over the world and they're bringing back all kinds of information and knowledge, which fires up uh, knowledge, the language, and all kinds of things as well. Again, I say for better or for worse. Do not want to get into the politics of things right now, but I would acknowledge that as well. And here is Elizabeth with a book. Now, here she is a woman and there's all kinds of restrictions on women and knowledge, how much they should learn. Is it dangerous for women to learn? Of course, in the Bible, there's the idea of Eve kind of being curious and getting everybody into trouble because she eats the apple. And yet here is a painting, a glorious painting, this beautiful silken overgarment that she's wearing, these ridiculously ornate golden sleeves, golden embroidery, rings. But what's the most prominent thing? What's the thing that's the most surprising? She's got her finger in a book. She's got her finger holding a place in a book as if she's saying to the painter, let's get this over with because I want to get back to reading. And Elizabeth actually was known for being one of the most educated monarchs of not only all of Europe, but really of all of history because she spoke several languages. She was trained by a tutor, a very famous tutor. I'm not gonna pronounce his name correctly, but I'm gonna try Ascham, Asham. And so she also is trained in rhetoric. Now, rhetoric, of course, means the ability to persuade people. So she was known as a persuader, as a communicator. And here she is in her youth, kind of symbolizing that here we are in an age of words, an age of thinking, right? Not just an age of religion. And she's got the cross, but the cross is not the most prominent thing. Um, and here is Shakespeare. Why am I showing Shakespeare? And I'm not showing him in his most typical representation. I'm showing him in a painting that was discovered later. Probably he looked a little bit like this. There's the earring, although there's a question of whether the earring was added later. But the reason I show Shakespeare as he might have actually looked is that for many years, maybe even centuries, people thought Shakespeare didn't exist, that maybe it was Queen Elizabeth who actually wrote the plays of Shakespeare. After all, she was incredibly accomplished in music, in art, in dancing, in speaking, in translation. Other people thought more often than the Queen Elizabeth theory, it was that actually Francis Bacon was the person who wrote the plays of Shakespeare. And in fact, Shakespeare left no written evidence of his authorship other than the fact that his actors, I mean, this has been proven, this has actually been looked at, and of course he did exist, but the fact that we don't have a lot of texts with Shakespeare's actual handwriting fed this, let's call it like urban legend, should we call it conspiracy theory? Let's call it. And so I want to show you Shakespeare because actually the language of Bacon could legitimately be, I wouldn't say confused with Shakespeare, but we could legitimately think, wow, this guy's writing about science. And as we'll see in a minute, the language is beautiful. The language is witty. It's humorous. It's full of beautiful metaphors. In one part, for example, he talks about how water falls from the sky in its pure form, and then we collect it in wells and cisterns and vases, urns because the water is pure. And he says that's what knowledge is. Knowledge is like water. It can be a very beautiful, sustaining thing, but we need to collect it. We can't just let it be, right? And so here's water as knowledge, right? So that's a typical kind of, uh, the Elizabethan English is full of things like that, full of metaphors. It's not, of course, not the only age that was clever in, wordplay and metaphors and symbolism, but the fact that Shakespeare used so many different um, kind of so many so many words, illustrative words, witty words, little turns of phrase, and so did Bacon. This is part of what fed these ideas. Here's James the First. Now, James the First, I have to say, gets a bad rap in many ways. When you read about him in history, they say that when James the First took over after Queen Elizabeth in 1603, I think it was. So technically, the book of that we're studying here, this Bacon book, was written under James's reign. And you remember before that I had showed you the first page, and I had showed you how it said to the king, illustrious king, all this kind of stuff. Now, James the First, whether it's true or not, called himself a very learned king. He was very proud of his learning. Remember, Queen Elizabeth was famous for her learning. James the First came down from Scotland. He was originally the king of Scotland. He came down from Scotland claiming this deep religious knowledge. And in fact, he will eventually sponsor this big research project into the ancient writings that became the scriptures and translated them into English in an edition that we call today, of course, the King James Bible. But the idea, the way he did it, the fact that he thought he can undertake this, and he was very confident about this, so he talked about theology and science and knowledge frequently, gave him that reputation as a learned king. Now, some historians are very unkind to King James and say, well, he was, not learned on the level of Queen Elizabeth or a level of true scholars of theology. But let's leave it just at the fact that Bacon at least thinks that this book and this bigger project that he has for science, for the collection of knowledge, Bacon is very, very, very serious about this project um, of instituting not just this notion, like a philosopher puts forward a notion or an argument, we should collect knowledge, we should look at it objectively, but actually having big dreams about having a state-sponsored project with thousands of people collecting knowledge, collecting data, going out into the field, coming back with that data, having a central archive where it's collected and developed and vetted and filtered, and so that this way we have almost like a kind of what today would be a research laboratory or a research institution or even a university. And this is the idea of the water collecting, you see? So the water collecting in one place is almost like we need a place to collect water, a quiet place, a clean place, a peaceful place, right? And that's what he calls this place, this university. So King James, whether he was really learned or not, whether he liked to think of himself in a vain way as learned, almost doesn't matter because Bacon seems to think he's going to get this support. And if we read Advancement of Learning really carefully, we will see that, in fact, Bacon spends a lot of energy figuring out and proposing this beautiful, not only way of learning, of collecting knowledge, but actually proposing almost the way you would propose a policy in government. And in fact, Bacon was in government, and so he had many reasons to believe that he could be that guy, right? So he rose further and further into the administration until he, you see here in this much more serious image than the one before, to the position of Lord Chancellor of England, so a policymaker. Um, he was ennobled. You know, he was born a commoner, but he was ennobled as a baron and then a viscount. Um, and that's how he looks. But what I want to really emphasize, and I'm going to close this part of the lecture so that we can go to part two. What I want to emphasize that he spent his entire life, whether he was Lord Chancellor, whether he was a little younger and just starting, you know, with his first few books, writing the essays and writing the advancement of learning. But I'm going to show you this last amazing image, which, you know, I admit I found it on Wikipedia, but it is actually an amazing image of the 18-year-old Bacon. And it seems that the guy who painted this little miniature, this kind of simple but beautiful, and I would say, oh, capture, you know, a miniature that really captures the spirit of Bacon, you know, his knowing eyes, his kind of, he's not an innocent 18-year-old. And it seems like the painter himself was captivated by something about Bacon because the writing along the edge, along this beautiful kind of cerulean blue edge, right? This celeste colored blue. The writing is, if one could but paint his mind,